Hello, Alex here, and in this video I want to talk about my first roll of the FPP's low ISO color film. An extremely low sensitivity ISO 1.6 color negative film which I shot in the Hasselblad XPan 2. Let's get into it. If you are at all familiar with the film photography project already, you're probably aware that aside from the normal films that most places sell, they sell a lot of weird and wacky stocks that generally aren't available to consumers, either because they're not meant to be used photographically, like this one, or they're sold in such huge quantities that it's generally not feasible for consumers to get their hands on them, like a 2,000-foot bulk roll. Also like this one. This is one of the more extreme stocks within their lineup, being such an extremely low sensitivity and having a very unique color palette. What the FPP call low ISO color film, Kodak themselves call Vision 3 Color Digital Intermediate 2254. People online often just call it Kodak 2254. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, and I am not a cinematographer, so, I'm definitely skimming details and probably getting quite a few things wrong. But the general idea is that when you shoot a movie on film, you have a master reel of ECN2 developed negatives that have that orange mask and are very low contrast. You basically contact print it with this film and you will get an interpositive, which has more contrast by adding contrast with this high contrast stock, and the blue cast will counteract some of that orange cast. This process can be done once or twice, and you might digitize at different points, or you might just directly scan the original master negative and color grade it from there. But in terms of analog duplication, that's what this is used for. It's used to duplicate master rolls of movies to make copies of them. Which is to say, it's not meant for photographic use whatsoever. And a lot of its drawbacks come from the fact it's not meant to be used to take still photographs. One immediate consequence of this is that there is no stated nominal ISO rating for this film from Kodak themselves, because it's not meant to be used to take photographs or movies. This film is, however, rated at ISO 1.6 by the Film Photography Project, though a lot of people online do recommend rating it a little bit slower, closer to ISO 1. That sounds really, really bad, but in practice it makes sense because a film like this should be as high resolution as possible, and it is very high resolution. So it doesn't really matter if during the contact printing process, or whatever it's called, when you're duplicating a movie, you have to turn up the lights a bit more. That doesn't really matter for those purposes. But in photographic terms, it does mean very long exposure times, but you do get that very high resolution. So, you wouldn't want to be shooting a Tarantino movie and then printing it onto like Fomapan. I don't know of any cameras that go that low in terms of ISO, at least on the dial. So realistically, you're going to be setting your camera to its lowest ISO setting and then adding more light either by opening the aperture or slowing down your shutter speed by a certain number of stops. For example, you might set your ISO setting to 25 and then add 4 more stops of some combination of shutter and aperture to get down to an effective EI of 1.5. This film is only available in the 35mm format from Kodak, and the Film Photography Project spool it down from those 2,000-foot bulk rolls into 24 exposure canisters, which are not DX coded for reasons that are probably fairly obvious at this stage. Like all Vision 3 films, it is intended for development in the ECN2 chemical process. The film does have an anti-static layer, but it is not remjet, which means you can develop it safely in C41 chemicals without worrying about remjet removal either at home or potentially, not telling your local lab that and destroying their C41 chemicals. So that is one of the major advantages of this film. Even in the cinema world, the lack of a remjet removal step just makes the process a lot simpler. Additionally, the emulsion is coated onto an S-star base, Kodak's name for polyester, and the negatives are rated for very, very long-term archival storage with, in the datasheet, over a century before you see even fairly slight degradation of the density of the dyes. So that's good to know, I guess? That matters more for cinematography, not really for our purposes, but it's still good to know it's a very technically high-quality film. As I mentioned, this film has a very strong blue cast, and that is meant to cancel out the strong orange mask of your ECN2 negatives. In practice for photography, that means that when you shoot it directly, you get a wide range of blue, cyan, teal, and purple tones, with very few colors actually pushing through that blue mask. Though reds do push through quite well, albeit slightly purple tinted. Still, it's very interesting to see that the reds poke through so strongly, so you could potentially play around with that in your scene for creative effect. It doesn't really matter or change anything, but I think it's kind of cool to say that if you hold the undeveloped film like the leader up to a light source, you'll see that strong orange color of the mask. But when you look at it with diffuse reflected light, it's actually kind of a blue-purple color, so that's just kind of cool to see. After developing the film in your standard C41 or ECN2 negative process, you get negatives, which have to be inverted either during the scanning or printing process to yield your final positive images. I shot this roll over the course of about 5 months in the Hasselblad XPan 2. I used all 3 lenses and I took a lot of shots that I don't really care for just to test the film under a variety of conditions, because I have a couple more rolls in the drawer and I wanted to learn how to shoot it, how it looks under different conditions, different lighting conditions, how different colors render, so I know better how to shoot the other rolls. So it's not completely a test roll, because I do quite like a lot of these shots and I did put some effort into them, but there's some of them are, definitely me just checking how white balance of your available light affects the final image. I made the interesting decision to load this film at sunset on one of the Ireland analog photo walks, which, turned out to be a bit of a mistake in terms of my exposure time. So after just 1 frame, I rewound the film and loaded a roll of 800T instead. But nevertheless, that one shot did come out very nicely. When I shot the roll, I did decide to go with what people had said online, and I rated the film at effectively EI 1.06. Not strictly EI 1, but essentially the same thing. I set the ISO to 25 and then added 4.5 stops of exposure compensation through some combination of the shutter and aperture. I had the film developed at a local lab and then scanned it with the EOS 1DX Mark III with the Canon EF 100mm f2.8 LIS USM macro lens, then inverted them in Negative Lab Pro and processed them to taste in Adobe Lightroom. The resolution of this film is mind-blowing. It is the highest resolution film I have ever shot in the 35mm format, and it is probably touching or slightly beyond the limits of my scanning setup at this time. I haven't shot CMS20 or Velvia in 35mm, fair enough, but this is a C41 film, so even if it isn't quite as good as them, it's probably the sharpest color negative film that you can get. Reciprocity. The exposure I took at sunset was the better part of 5 minutes. I applied no reciprocity correction, and it's only as underexposed as I made the shot to protect the highlights in the sky in that fairly high contrast scene, because I knew that the film had high contrast natively. As I mentioned earlier, the anti-static layer is not remjet, and that has huge implications for the availability and ease of processing of this film. Just about anybody can get this done, just about anywhere, and that is a huge difference compared to all other Vision 3 films. Remember, the average person doesn't develop their own film at home, so being able to just drop it off somewhere for C41 processing, fantastic. Even if the color palette of this film isn't for you, if you want that really high resolution microfilm type look of something like CMS20, I know it's not probably as sharp as that, but very, very high resolution 35mm film without the nuance and particularities of actually shooting and developing microfilm, you could shoot this stuff, develop it in C41 and just convert it black and white. It's not a black and white film. It's not a normal color film either. You don't have a normal balance of the red, green and blue channels. But still, playing around with it, I got some pretty nice results with black and white conversions, and the high resolution could potentially work as some sort of a substitute for a really, really high resolution black and white film. Even if the colors are to your taste, it's not really shootable in a lot of conditions. It's a very slow film. I've shot slower. I'm kind of known for that amongst my friends. But even so, it's not very easy to shoot such a slow film under even sunny 16 conditions. Even under Irish sunny 16 conditions, I was looking at shutter speeds of 1/8 to 1/30 of a second at f4, which is the fastest aperture you can shoot on the Hasselblad XPan lenses. So it's not great. A lot of the time I did end up shooting on a tripod, which is fine, but you know, if you want to walk around and take pictures, high resolution pictures, things like CMS20 are several stops faster if that's your end goal, or even if you want something slightly faster, FPP offer ISO 3 and ISO 6 low speed color negative films that may be more generally applicable to what you want to do, how you might shoot. But if you're using flash or very fast aperture lenses kind of wide open during the day, it might be an option. But you know, it's not something you're gonna be just hand holding all the time. Even if you like the colors, they're not always there. There are some shots where I had to add a lot of blue back in post in white balancing, but the actual native inversion from Negative Lab Pro, yeah, not great. They came out very washed out and faded with not much saturation in the blue channel, and not in a good way. The extremely high resolution of this film does come at a cost, that being it's very unforgiving in terms of focusing errors or motion blur. Motion blur being a bigger problem when you're dealing with such slow shutter speeds to begin with. So, you know, it's very tempting to just use this film on a tripod with a narrow aperture. But hey, playing around with it at wide apertures at faster shutter speeds during the day is something I still want to try. But I'm not going to be surprised if a lot of those pictures are completely out of focus. But we'll see. Lastly, the high contrast of this film does come at the cost of a certain amount of dynamic range. You do clip your highlights a little bit easier than certain other color negative films, and the shadows do go a bit muddy quite quickly. That said, it's not the worst, but it's still not a very good performance in that regard. I would say it's slightly less forgiving than Kodak XPan, which isn't that forgiving to begin with. It's not a slide film, but as color negative film goes, you do have to be a bit more careful with your exposure, which you probably are being, I guess, if you're shooting something so slow anyway. So this first shot was shot with the 45mm lens, and I'm just quite a fan of it. There's a strong gradient from the bottom left to the top right of where the dark blue's in the frame line, and that sort of leads your eye up from the dark depths of the corner up towards that door. It's very high contrast, and it's quite punchy, and it's a simple, not minimalist, but very empty shot, and it's the kind of thing I think might have been better with someone like smoking there, but I don't think it works too badly without anyone in the frame, so to speak. It's a picture of a scene rather than a subject, and I think it kind of works. Could have been better perhaps, but I quite like it regardless. You've already seen this. This is the sunset shot that I took. This was the better part of a 5-minute exposure, and the water is just completely blown to mist, and I'm really liking that. This was shot with a 30mm. I probably could have done this with the 45. I did try cropping it in at one point, and it looked not better, but slightly different. So, you know, in future, I might just try that instead. I did actually use the center ND filter for this to kind of combat vignetting, and it worked out very well. It's a simple shot of Dublin. It's a very strong centered composition, which I think works well for this particular image. Though I would like to try some more long, like really long exposure shots with water with this film with a more asymmetric composition. That said, very long exposure, very happy with it. So this is my favorite shot from the roll, and I really do like it. I shot it with the 45mm on a tripod for I think like 4 seconds, something like that. And yeah, it works out really nicely. What I'm quite fond of is that one little patch of white foam in the lower right that balances out what's otherwise a very empty frame. And the long, but not excessively long exposure in this case really gives you a sense of the strength and energy behind the water crashing against the rocks. It's a very L-shaped composition, as I like to think of these things, and it works really strongly here. You've got the nice, lighter, more sky blue in the water, and that deeper navy blue in the rocks, with various shades of pale blue and the white. I think it works really nicely for what is essentially a monochromatic image. This image does also actually work quite nicely in black and white, but I do definitely prefer the color version of it. Overall, very happy with it. If not for that white patch of foam in the lower right, I probably wouldn't give a damn about this photo, but it's quite balanced and nice as a result. So who is this film for, and would I recommend it? For the average person? Absolutely not. This film is a pain in the ass to shoot, but unlike a lot of other technical films that have been repurposed for photography, It's not as bad, and it does actually admittedly stack up with extremely high resolution, fantastic reciprocity characteristics, and overall great image quality. But that comes at the cost of needing either a very stable tripod or a very sharp, very fast lens that you can focus well. It's just a little bit too out there to recommend for most people. Like, the average person shooting this stuff might get lab scans back that throw away a lot of information in that JPEG, and then you're kind of stuck with something that maybe isn't representative of what this film could have done for that scene. Or if you're in the microfilm world, maybe this might be your own Ilford XP2, so to speak. You know, your C41 chromogenic black and white film, if you treat it that way. I know it's not the same, and the dyes, the ratio of colors is completely off, but it might be worth a try. It is very unpredictable, and I haven't learned as much about it and how it renders different colors as I would have hoped, trying it under different lighting conditions, daylight, nighttime, indoors, outdoors, overcast, bright sun. I can't really see a trend, and the shots that didn't come out with the right color palette that I was expecting were shot under different conditions, so I can't even nail it down to say overcast weather makes this film not look too good. So I'm not sure how much I really learned shooting this first roll of the stuff, but I definitely enjoyed it, so I'm gonna call it a success overall. Sort of. That's all I have to say about this film, so stay safe, and bye-bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shaka1277 for new pictures every day. If you like this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.